Sign it or get out of my life." Richard Clayton threw the prenuptial agreement across the mahogany table, his voice cold, as he told Abigail she had 48 hours to comply or lose everything, him, the house, the future she had believed in. She signed. 15 years later, he sat in courtroom 217, certain that same signature would destroy her. But the quietest woman in that room had spent 15 years preparing for this exact moment, and Richard Clayton had no idea what was about to happen to him. If you believe in justice, subscribe to this channel, follow this story to the very end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning of the hearing, Richard Clayton arrived at the Dirksen Federal Building 18 minutes early. That was not by accident. Richard did everything with calculation. He chose the navy blue suit, not the charcoal, because his attorney, Marcus Webb, had told him once that navy read as trustworthy to judges over 60. He had his assistant press it twice. He wore no tie clip because tie clips read as arrogant. He carried a single leather portfolio under his arm, thin and understated, because men who arrived with stacks of documents looked nervous. Richard Clayton never looked nervous. He had spent 30 years in commercial real estate, ensuring that every room he entered already belonged to him before he crossed the threshold. Courtroom 217A was no different. He pushed through the heavy oak doors at 7:52 and immediately scanned the room the way he scanned every room. Exits first, then the power positions, then the people who didn't matter. The gallery benches were already half filled. He recognized a journalist from the Tribune seated in the third row, and he made a mental note to have his publicist ready for the narrative afterward. The bailiff near the flag looked bored. The court reporter was arranging her machine with the focused disinterest of someone who had heard everything and been moved by none of it. Then he saw Abigail. She was already seated at the plaintiff's table on the left side of the room, her hands folded in front of her on the polished wood. She wore a gray suit that Richard didn't recognize, understated, almost deliberately plain. Her hair was pulled back simply. She was not looking at the door. She was not looking at anyone. She appeared to be reading something in a thin folder on the table in front of her, and she turned a page with the kind of quiet patience that Richard had always found infuriating in her. He had expected her to look frightened. He had expected red eyes, maybe, some trembling. After all, she was facing the end of the only financially secure life she had ever known. She had grown up in a small house in Rockford, Illinois, the daughter of a retired teacher and a woman who repaired watches for a living. She had worked as a librarian. She drove a used Honda until the year they married. Everything she had came from Richard, through Richard, because of Richard. And today, a judge was going to confirm what the prenuptial agreement had already declared in black ink 15 years ago. She was entitled to almost none of it. And yet she looked like a woman waiting for a bus. Richard pulled out his chair and sat down beside Marcus Webb, who was already arranging his documents in the precise and slightly theatrical way that expensive attorneys arrange documents when they wanted the other side to see the volume of their preparation. "She bring anyone?" Richard asked quietly. Marcus glanced across the room. "Daniel Holt, family law attorney, mid-level firm, decent reputation. No trial experience to speak of on anything at this dollar value." "Good," Richard said, and he clicked open his portfolio and stared at the summary sheet on top, though he wasn't reading it. He was watching Abigail's reflection in the glass partition along the side wall. She still hadn't looked up. Marcus leaned slightly closer. "Judge Caldwell has reviewed the prenuptial agreement. His clerk confirmed he received our brief yesterday evening. We're in excellent position." "I know we're in excellent position," Richard said. "I just want to make sure you're—" "I'm fine, Marcus." The truth was, Richard was better than fine. He had spent 3 weeks with Marcus reviewing every possible avenue of attack, and they had systematically dismantled each one. The prenuptial agreement was airtight. He had paid 3 separate attorneys to review it at the time of signing. Every clause had been drafted to ensure that in the event of divorce, the marital estate would be evaluated on the narrowest possible interpretation, which meant his corporate holdings, his trusts, his investment vehicles, and the commercial portfolio he had been building since before they met were entirely off limits. What Abigail was entitled to under the terms she had signed was a single payment of $500,000 and the right to retain any personal property she had brought into the marriage. She had brought a Honda Civic, a library card, and a collection of first edition novels. He had a legal team that cost more per hour than her annual salary had been when they met. This was not a fight. This was a formality dressed in wood paneling and bad fluorescent lighting. At 8:15, the bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Harrison Caldwell entered. Richard had researched the man. 63 years old, 31 years on the bench, known for efficiency and an almost clinical distaste for emotional testimony. He had 2 daughters, both grown, but Richard's investigator had noted that Caldwell had a reputation for ruling strictly on the documented record, not on sympathy. He wore his disinterest like a second robe. Richard approved of this. Disinterest served the stronger argument, and the stronger argument in this case was written in the prenuptial agreement that Abigail had signed of her own free will. Caldwell settled himself, adjusted his reading glasses, and looked at both tables with the expression of a man who had seen this particular production performed 1,000 times and had no illusions about how it would end. Docket 217A, he said. Clayton versus Clayton. Dissolution of marriage and determination of marital assets. Counsel for the petitioner, please identify yourself. Marcus Webb stood smoothly. Marcus Webb of Webb, Garrett, and Holloway appearing for the petitioner Richard Clayton. And for the respondent. A man at the other table stood. He was younger than Marcus, slightly rumpled, with an earnest quality that Richard recognized immediately as the most expensive liability a client could have in a courtroom. Daniel Holt of Holt Family Law appearing for the respondent Abigail Clayton. Abigail still did not look up from the folder in front of her. Caldwell nodded and opened his own folder. I have reviewed the prenuptial agreement submitted by petitioner's counsel and the response filed by respondent's counsel. Before we proceed, I'll note for the record that the prenuptial agreement in question was executed on September the 14th, 15 years ago in the state of Illinois, and was reviewed and signed by both parties with independent legal counsel present. Respondent's counsel, is there any threshold challenge to the validity of this agreement you intend to raise before we proceed to asset distribution? Daniel Holt stood again. He looked briefly like a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say and then forgotten it at the worst possible moment. Your Honor, the respondent does intend to challenge certain elements of the prenuptial agreement's applicability. Yes. Caldwell's expression did not change. On what grounds? We intend to argue that the circumstances under which the agreement was signed were coercive and that certain financial disclosures made at the time were materially incomplete, which would affect the agreement's enforceability under Illinois statute. There was a pause that felt longer than it was. Caldwell took off his reading glasses, polished them on his sleeve, and replaced them. Counsel, those are serious allegations that carry significant evidentiary burden. Do you have documentation to support a coercion claim? We do, Your Honor, and we intend to introduce it at the appropriate time. Very well. Caldwell looked at Marcus. Petitioner's counsel, you may proceed with the asset overview. Richard watched Marcus stand smooth his jacket with a single practiced motion and begin. There was something deeply satisfying about watching Marcus Webb work. The man was not brilliant in the way that some attorneys were brilliant. He did not improvise, did not dazzle, was not given to the kind of courtroom theatrics that juries loved and judges endured. What Marcus did was simpler and more devastating. He constructed arguments the way Richard constructed buildings. Foundation first, then structure, then the finishing details that made everything look inevitable. Your Honor, Marcus began, the petitioner's position is straightforward and fully supported by the documentation before this court. At the time, Richard Clayton and Abigail Marsh, now Abigail Clayton, entered into their prenuptial agreement. Mr. Clayton had already accumulated significant assets through 15 years of independent business activity. Those assets, along with any growth derivative income or expansion thereof, were explicitly carved out of the marital estate in Article 3 of the agreement, which the respondent reviewed, negotiated, and signed. He paused. He always paused here. It was the pause that said, this is the part where you understand we have already won. The marital estate, properly defined under the terms of the agreement, consists of the marital residence in Lincoln Park, which is encumbered by a mortgage and certain joint personal accounts totaling approximately $214,000. Beyond that, the respondent is entitled to the contractual payment of $500,000 specified in Article 7. The petitioner is prepared to satisfy that obligation immediately upon the court's ruling. Caldwell was writing something. He didn't look up. And the respondent's position with respect to the corporate holdings. Marcus allowed himself a brief, courteous expression that managed to communicate that the question had already been answered. The corporate holdings are entirely excluded under Article 3, Your Honor. They predate the marriage in their foundational structure, and their growth during the marriage is attributable to Mr. Clayton's business acumen and the activities of his professional team, not to any contribution of the respondent. From across the room, Richard heard Daniel Holt clear his throat. Your Honor, the respondent disputes the characterization that she made no contribution to Mr. Clayton's business interests during the marriage. Caldwell looked at him. On what basis? Abigail Clayton was not merely a domestic partner, Your Honor. She participated materially in the management of several of the Clayton family's real estate development projects during the early years of the marriage, specifically in a period between... Was she compensated as an employee or consultant? Holt hesitated. That hesitation cost him something. Richard could feel it. No, Your Honor. Was she listed as a partner or officer in any of the relevant business entities? No, Your Honor. Did the business entities fall within the carve-out under Article 3? Another pause. Under the terms of the current agreement as written, yes, but we believe those terms were accepted under circumstances that... You've noted your coercion argument, counsel. I'll hear that when we get to it. Caldwell turned back to Marcus. Continue. Richard leaned back by a fraction of an inch. He kept his face entirely still, but something in his chest settled, and he allowed himself the private satisfaction of a man watching a machine run exactly the way he had built it. Marcus presented the numbers with the clean confidence of a man unrolling a blueprint in front of a client who had already agreed to buy. The empire Richard had built was not described as an empire's invited challenge. Marcus called it a portfolio. Clean word, neutral word. A portfolio had structure documentation, paper trails, legal architecture. It was not something built from ruthlessness and calculation and 15 years of treating every human relationship as a leverage opportunity. It was simply a portfolio, and the portfolio was his, and the prenuptial agreement said so, and the prenuptial agreement was valid, and therefore the portfolio was his. $85 million in commercial real estate holdings, corporate structures in 4 states, investment vehicles registered in Delaware with the kind of layered complexity that discouraged inquiry, and a payout offer to his wife of 15 years that was, Richard knew, designed to be just large enough to seem generous to a judge while being just small enough to ensure she could never sustain a legal challenge. $500,000. He had spent more than that on the renovation of his Lakeshore Drive penthouse. He had spent more than that on a single development deal that had failed within 6 months and that he had written off without losing a night of sleep. $500,000 was not a settlement. It was a message. And the message was, you signed, and I built it all, and none of this was ever really yours. Across the room, Abigail hadn't moved. That was the part that Richard kept coming back to even as Marcus spoke, and the judge made notes, and the bailiff stifled a yawn. Abigail was not reacting. She was not flinching. She was not exchanging whispered urgencies with Daniel Holt, or staring at the judge with the frightened calculation of someone watching the door close on her future. She was sitting with her hands folded on the table, and once in a while she turned a page in the thin folder in front of her, and she looked, of all things, patient. Richard did not like patience that he had not authorized. In 30 years of business, he had learned to read a room, and more specifically to read the people in a room who were not yet defeated. There was a particular quality to someone who was still working a stillness that was not resignation, but concentration, a quiet that held possibility rather than surrender. He had watched it across boardroom tables and negotiating sessions and more than one courtroom. He had learned to recognize it, and he had learned to close deals fast when he saw it, before the other side could execute whatever they were thinking. He was looking at it now, and it sat cold in the back of his mind like a stone in a pool. He told himself it was nothing. She was a librarian. She had no legal training, no financial expertise, no access to the corporate structure that his attorneys had spent 2 years fortifying specifically against any challenge she might raise. She had Daniel Holt, who was decent and earnest, and was currently being systematically outmaneuvered by a man who billed at $500 an hour. She had nothing. Marcus finished his summary and sat down, and Caldwell looked across at Holt. "Counsel for the respondent, you have the floor." Daniel Holt stood, and for a moment, just a moment, he glanced down at Abigail. She gave him the smallest nod Richard had ever seen. So small that Richard almost missed it. "Your Honor," Holt began, "the respondent's position is that the prenuptial agreement before this court cannot be enforced because its foundational premise that the asset disclosures made at the time of signing were complete and accurate is false." The room was quiet. Caldwell looked at him over his glasses. "That is a serious claim, Mr. Holt." "It is, Your Honor. We believe the evidence will show that at the time the prenuptial agreement was executed, Mr. Clayton held significant financial interests that were not disclosed to the respondent or her counsel, that the agreement was presented under conditions that do not meet Illinois standards for valid prenuptial execution, and that since the time of signing, Mr. Clayton has used the corporate structure protected by that agreement to conceal assets from marital accounting." The room shifted. Not dramatically. Courtrooms don't shift dramatically when lawyers make accusations, because lawyers make accusations constantly, and most of them dissolve like smoke against the weight of evidence. But something in the quality of the silence changed, and Richard felt it. He turned to Marcus and kept his voice at a level just above a murmur. "Deal with this." Marcus leaned slightly toward him. "He's posturing. He has no act. Deal with it," Richard said again. Marcus stood. "Your Honor, Petitioner's counsel would like to note that the respondent's characterization of Mr. Clayton's financial disclosures is unsubstantiated, and I haven't asked for your note, Mr. Webb." Caldwell's voice was even. "Sit down." Marcus sat. Caldwell looked at Holt. "What evidence do you intend to introduce in support of these claims?" Holt reached down to the table in front of him. "Your Honor, at this time, the respondent would like to submit Exhibit A into the record." He picked up a plain manila folder. Just a folder. Standard size, no label on the tab, the kind of thing you could buy at any office supply store for $3. Richard watched it cross the bar and pass through the bailiff's hands to the clerk, who handed it up to the judge. Caldwell opened it. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he looked up at Holt. "Counsel, can you identify for the record what I'm looking at?" "Yes, Your Honor." Those are the opening pages of a financial record set from a private banking institution in Geneva, Switzerland. The account referenced in those documents is registered to a holding entity incorporated in the Cayman Islands. And what is the connection of this entity to the petitioner? We will establish that connection fully through the complete record set, which is extensive. But at this time, we would ask the court to note one specific detail on page 3 of that exhibit. Caldwell turned pages. His expression, which had started the morning as efficient neutrality, had changed in a way that was subtle, and to Richard suddenly alarming. The judge's reading glasses had come off his face and were being held rather than resting on his nose, as if he wanted unobstructed vision. "The name of the trust," Caldwell said slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." "The trust is named," he paused. "The trust is named the Eleanor Marsh Trust." Holt said, "Eleanor Marsh was the respondent's sister. She passed away 11 years ago." The room did not erupt. Courtrooms do not erupt. But there was a quality of arrested breath in the gallery, a collective pause, as if everyone in the room had just inhaled and not yet decided whether to let the air go. Richard did not move. He could feel Marcus turn to look at him, and he did not look back. He kept his eyes on Caldwell, who had placed the folder on the bench in front of him and was sitting very, very still in the way that judges sit still when they are no longer evaluating an argument but have begun to evaluate a person. And across the room, for the first time since he had entered the courtroom that morning, Abigail Clayton looked up. She looked directly at Richard. Her expression held no triumph, no anger, no grief, no fear. It held something that Richard could not immediately name because he had spent so little of his life encountering it honestly. It was the expression of a woman who had known exactly how this moment would arrive and had waited for it with the absolute patience of someone who understood that the truth does not rush, it ripens, and that this particular truth had been 15 years in the growing tended in silence in the privacy of a mind that everyone in this room had underestimated because she had let them. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she looked back down at her folder, turned the final page, and folded her hands. Judge Caldwell set down the exhibit. "We will take a 15-minute recess," he said, "and when we reconvene, I want complete documentation of this trust structure before this court. Mr. Webb, your client will remain in the building. Mr. Holt." He looked at Daniel Holt with an expression that had shifted from the efficient neutrality of a man managing a routine dissolution to something considerably more focused. "Tell your client I said well done." Marcus turned to Richard, and this time Richard looked back. Marcus's face said everything that Marcus's disciplined professionalism would not allow his mouth to say. Richard picked up his portfolio, set it back down, and said nothing. Outside the high windows of courtroom 217A, the city of Chicago moved through its morning with complete indifference to the fact that inside this room, in front of this judge holding this folder, a woman who had once been called just a librarian had just changed everything, and she had not raised her voice. She had not made a speech. She had simply waited until the right moment opened a folder and handed the truth to the one person in the room with the authority to use it. The recess clock began to run. Richard stared at the wood grain of the table in front of him and understood for the first time in 30 years of building his empire room by room, deal by deal, signature by signature, that someone had been watching every single move he made, and that the someone had been sitting 12 feet away from him, reading a folder, waiting for a bus. The 15-minute recess that Judge Caldwell had called did not feel like 15 minutes. For Richard Clayton, it felt like the floor of a building he had constructed with his own hands, slowly separating from its foundation, not collapsing, not yet, but shifting in that terrible preliminary way that every engineer knows precedes the fall. He sat in the anteroom off the main corridor with Marcus Webb across from him, and Marcus was speaking, but Richard was not entirely hearing him, because the part of his mind that had run calculations for 30 years was running them now at a speed that produced no usable output, the Eleanor Marsh Trust. He said nothing for a long time. Marcus had his phone out and was speaking in a lowered, rapid voice to someone at the firm. Richard caught fragments. Offshore disclosure, Cayman exposure, document retrieval timeline. Each phrase landed like a stone in still water, and the circles spread. "Richard." Marcus put the phone face down on the small table between them. "I need you to talk to me right now, not as your friend, as your attorney. I am talking to you. You're sitting there. That's not the same thing." Marcus leaned forward. "That trust, the Eleanor Marsh Trust, I need to know what I'm about to walk back into that courtroom defending." Richard looked at him for a long moment. "You're about to walk in there and argue that a Cayman Islands trust structure has no bearing on this proceeding. I can't argue that if the judge has documentation connecting it to you. Then argue the documentation is incomplete." "Richard, argue it's incomplete, Marcus." His voice was flat and precise, the voice he used when a subordinate was failing to execute a directive. "That's what I pay you for. Argue it's preliminary. It's out of context. It requires further discovery, and that the Respondents' Counsel is introducing it for theatrical effect without establishing foundation. That's your job." Marcus was quiet for a beat. Then he said quietly, "How much is in it?" Richard picked up his portfolio. "Go do your job." The recess ended. They filed back in, and Richard noticed 2 things immediately upon returning to the courtroom. The first was that the journalist from the Tribune had moved from the 3rd row to the 1st. The second was that Abigail was already seated, and she had been joined at the respondents' table by a second person, a woman Richard didn't recognize, somewhere in her mid-40s, wearing a dark blazer and carrying a document case that was significantly thicker than anything Daniel Holt had brought. Richard sat down and said nothing to Marcus. But Marcus had seen her too, and Richard could tell from the way Marcus arranged and then rearranged his papers that he was recalibrating. Caldwell entered without ceremony. He sat. He looked at the room. He looked at Abigail's table. Mr. Holt, he said, before we continue, would you introduce your colleague to the court? Holt stood. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Miss Patricia Vance of the firm Vance & Associates, who has been co-counsel in this matter and will be presenting the evidentiary portion of the respondent's case. Caldwell looked at Marcus. Mr. Webb, any objection? Marcus stood with the composed expression of a man who had several objections and had decided that none of them would help him. No objection, Your Honor. Very well. Ms. Vance, you have the floor. Patricia Vance stood, and she did it without any of the preliminary adjusting and smoothing and clearing of throat that marked attorneys who were performing confidence rather than possessing it. She simply rose, opened her document case, and looked at the judge. Your Honor, what Mr. Holt introduced before the recess represents only the first layer of what the respondent intends to present today. With the court's permission, I'd like to walk through the full record set systematically because the picture it assembles is not a simple one, and it requires context to be understood completely. Caldwell said, "Proceed." The Eleanor Marsh Trust was established 11 years ago, approximately 4 months after the death of Eleanor Marsh, who was Abigail Clayton's younger sister. The trust is registered in the Cayman Islands under a holding structure that on its face appears entirely disconnected from Richard Clayton or any of his corporate entities. The trustees of record are 2 individuals whose names will mean nothing to this court because they are registered agents, not beneficial owners. That is intentional, that is by design. She let that land for exactly 1 second. The beneficial owner of the Eleanor Marsh Trust, Your Honor, is Richard Clayton. Marcus was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making a declarative assertion without— I'm about to show the foundation, Mr. Webb, if you'll give me 30 seconds, Vance said without looking at him. Caldwell held up a hand. Mr. Webb, sit. Ms. Vance, show your foundation. She opened the second tab of her document case and handed a stack to the bailiff. The court is now receiving Exhibit B, which consists of wire transfer records obtained through formal international legal process from a private banking institution in Geneva. These records document a series of wire transfers beginning approximately 12 years ago and continuing through last year. The source of the funds in each transfer traces back through a sequence of intermediate entities to Claimant Holdings, LLC, a Delaware corporation wholly owned by Richard Clayton. The bailiff handed copies across. Marcus opened his, and Richard watched the man's jaw tighten by a fraction, which told Richard everything he needed to know about what was on the pages. He did not look at his own copy. The total amount transferred into the Eleanor Marsh Trust over this period, Vance continued, is $122 million. The journalist in the front row wrote something. Richard kept his eyes on the middle distance and thought about the fact that he had once sat in a boardroom in this same city and watched a deal worth $40 million collapse in under an hour because someone had found a single line in a subsidiary filing that his team had overlooked. He had watched the man across the table from him that day lose the color in his face in real time. He had thought then that it was one of the most clarifying things he had ever witnessed, the moment a man realizes that the structure he believed was protecting him was actually the structure that would bury him. He thought about that now with a detachment that surprised him. Your Honor, Vance said, we are not alleging that Mr. Clayton was simply clever in his financial planning. We are alleging something considerably more serious. The Eleanor Marsh Trust was not a legitimate estate or investment vehicle. It was constructed for a specific purpose to hold assets that Richard Clayton wished to remove from any accounting that might become relevant in the event of divorce proceedings. The use of his deceased sister-in-law's identity as the nominal beneficiary of record was not coincidental. It was chosen because a deceased individual cannot be contacted, cannot consent or object, and because the name would appear to a casual examination to represent a legitimate bequest from a grieving family. Caldwell had not moved for several minutes. Ms. Vance, he said, are you representing to this court that the identity of the deceased was used fraudulently in the establishment of this trust? We are Your Honor, and we have documentation to support that representation. She handed the bailiff a third set of documents. Richard saw Marcus reach for his copy, open it, and then set it down with a care that was too controlled, which meant Marcus was afraid that if he was not careful, he would put it down hard. Exhibit C. Vance said, contains the original trust incorporation documents from the Cayman Islands Registry, obtained through international legal assistance. Those documents include a signature on the founding declaration. The signature purports to be that of Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor Marsh died 11 months before the date on that signature. No one in the gallery spoke. Richard heard his own breathing. Caldwell picked up the document. He looked at it for a long time. When he set it back down, he looked at Marcus Webb with an expression that Richard had never seen on a judge's face in any of the proceedings he had sat through over 30 years, and Richard had sat through many. "Mr. Webb," Caldwell said, "before Ms. Vance continues, I want to give you an opportunity to respond. Specifically, I want to know whether you have any knowledge of the matters being described." Marcus stood. His posture was impeccable, his voice was controlled, but Richard had worked with the man for 11 years, and he knew the slight upward pull at the corners of Marcus's mouth that meant Marcus was experiencing something he would not characterize as fear, but that functioned identically. "Your Honor, Petitioner's counsel is not in a position to speak to the specific documents being introduced, as we have not had adequate time to review them. We would request an opportunity for full discovery before the court treats any of this material as established." "The material is before the court. Now, Mr. Webb, I'll ask my question differently. Does your client deny that the Eleanor Marsh Trust exists?" A pause. "Your Honor, yes or no, counsel." Marcus turned very slightly to Richard. Richard said nothing. Marcus turned back to the judge. "Petitioner does not deny that a trust by that name exists, Your Honor. Petitioner disputes the characterization of, does your client deny that he is the beneficial owner of that trust?" Richard put his hand on Marcus's arm. It was a light touch, deliberate, the kind of touch that said, "Stop talking." Marcus stopped. Caldwell looked at Richard directly. Judges rarely look directly at parties in civil proceedings. They addressed counsel. They referenced parties in the third person. The fact that Caldwell was looking at Richard Clayton as if Richard were the only person in the room told Richard that the nature of this proceeding had changed in a way that went beyond the divorce. "Mr. Clayton," the judge said, and then he said nothing else. Richard looked back at him. Marcus leaned to his ear. "Say nothing," he said, barely audible. Richard said nothing. Caldwell wrote something on the notepad in front of him. Then he looked at Vance. "Continue." Vance continued. She was thorough. Richard would grant her that. She worked through the exhibits with the patience of a surgeon. No dramatic pauses, no rhetorical flourish, no performance. Just document after document, each one placed in relation to the previous one, each one tightening the structure of what she was building. Wire transfers cross-referenced with Clayton corporate accounting records. The intermediate holding entities and their registration dates. Notarized documents bearing dates that did not align with the signatory's legal existence, tax filings that reported income that did not appear in the trust records, and trust records that showed assets that did not appear in the tax filings. The picture that assembled itself in that courtroom was not a picture of a clever man hiding money. It was a picture of a man who had over more than a decade constructed an elaborate parallel financial architecture using a dead woman's name, stolen corporate profits, forged documentation, and the quiet confidence of someone who believed that the distance between the Cayman Islands and a Chicago divorce court was too great for any connection to be drawn. The distance had not been great enough. About 40 minutes in, Patricia Vance looked up from her documents for the first time in a while and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to pause on one specific point because I think it's important that the court understands the magnitude of what we're describing." Caldwell said, "Go ahead." The trust holds $122 million. The prenuptial agreement before this court governs a marital estate that Petitioner's counsel has valued at approximately $214,000 in joint accounts plus the marital residence. If the trust assets are determined to be marital property, or in the alternative, if the prenuptial agreement is voided due to the fraudulent financial disclosures made at the time of its execution, the asset picture before this court changes by a factor of several hundred. Caldwell nodded once. "I understand the arithmetic, counsel." "There's one further point," Vance said. She looked down at her documents, and then she looked up at the judge, and something in her expression shifted slightly. Not becoming emotional, because she was not a woman who allowed herself to become emotional in a courtroom, but becoming something adjacent to it. Something that recognized that the next thing she was about to say existed on a different register from wire transfers and notarization dates. The Eleanor Marsh Trust is named after a woman who was 26 years old when she died. Eleanor Marsh was Abigail Clayton's younger sister. She taught second grade at a public school in Rockford, Illinois. She passed away from an illness that the family could not fully treat because they did not have adequate medical resources. She never owned property. She never held a financial account of any significance. She never knew that her name would be used in this way. Vance paused. She never knew that the man her sister married would take her identity after her death and use it as a shell for $122 million of hidden assets. The courtroom was very quiet. Richard did not look at Abigail. He had made a decision several minutes ago not to look at Abigail because some part of him, the part that had been calculating and building and protecting for 30 years, understood that looking at her right now would cost him something he could not afford to lose, which was the ability to continue functioning as if this were a problem to be managed rather than what it actually was. But he could feel her there across the room in the way you can feel a room's temperature without looking at a thermometer. Caldwell said, "Ms. Vance is the respondent prepared to submit all exhibits into the record today." "Yes, Your Honor. We have a complete record set ready for submission, 23 exhibits in total." "Mr. Webb." Caldwell turned. "I'm going to give you 1 hour to review the material before we reconvene for your response. I want to be very clear about something." He removed his glasses entirely and looked at Marcus with the focused stillness of a man who has spent 30 years issuing statements and means every word of every one of them. What has been presented in this courtroom today has moved this proceeding substantially beyond the scope of a standard dissolution of marriage. I am going to consult with the Federal District Clerk's office during this recess. I want you to factor that into whatever conversation you have with your client in the next 60 minutes. Marcus said, "Yes, Your Honor." Richard heard those words, Federal District Clerk's office, and felt the stone in the pool drop deeper. They took their hour in a conference room on the 4th floor that smelled of old carpet and somebody's reheated lunch. Marcus sat across from Richard with his jacket off, for the first time Richard could ever remember seeing, and he put both hands flat on the table and he said, "Richard, I have to know everything, right now. Not the version you gave me before. Everything." Richard looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at Marcus. "How bad is it?" he asked. "How bad is—" Marcus stopped, breathed, started again. "Richard, she has documentation that connects the trust to Claymont through 6 intermediary entities. She has the forged signature on the founding declaration. She has 12 years of wire transfer records. She has notarized documents bearing the signature of a woman who had been dead for nearly a year at the time of signing. She has tax filings that contradict the trust records. Judge Caldwell just told us he's calling the federal clerk." Marcus leaned forward. "She didn't assemble this in the last 6 months. She didn't assemble this in the last year. This took years. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Your wife has been building this case for years, while you were sitting across the breakfast table from her, while you were filing our responses, while we were in this building this morning, convinced we had already won." Richard said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "What are my options?" Marcus sat back. "You have 2. Right now today you have 2, and one of them disappears by the time we walk back into that courtroom." He held up one finger. 1. You acknowledge the trust. You acknowledge it's yours. You accept that the prenuptial agreement will be voided for fraudulent disclosure. You cooperate fully. You give Abigail what the court will likely award her under equitable distribution, which at this asset level is going to be significant, and you accept the civil and potentially criminal consequences that follow. You do not fight. You do not stonewall. You give the federal investigators full cooperation, and you hope that cooperation functions as mitigation. He held up a second finger. 2. You continue to deny. You dispute the documents you claim insufficient foundation. You request full discovery. You delay. The judge refers to federal investigation. You spend the next 3 to 5 years in litigation at every level. And at the end of that process, when every document has been subpoenaed, and every account has been traced, and every signature has been analyzed, you arrive at exactly the same destination. You arrive at under option 1. Except by then, you've spent everything you have left on attorneys. You have 0 cooperation credit. And the federal prosecutor's office has had 3 to 5 years to build the kind of case that ends in a sentence, not a settlement. Richard was quiet. "She did this," he said finally. "Not accusatory, more like a man identifying the source of a structural failure. Analytical, clinical." "She did this," Marcus confirmed. "How did she get the bank records?" "I don't know yet, but I'd note that she had 15 years, Richard. And I'd note that for 15 years she had access to your life in ways that no investigator could replicate from outside. She lived in your house. She saw your correspondence. She knew which questions to ask because she knew which answers you thought she'd never go looking for." Richard picked up his portfolio, looked at it, and set it back down. "She was a librarian," he said. It was the same thing Marcus had said in the courtroom that morning, delivered with the same casual contempt that Richard's entire legal strategy had been built upon, except that now in this 4th-floor conference room, without the judge and the bailiff and the polished performance of certainty that a good courtroom creates, the sentence landed differently. She was a librarian. She knew how to find things. She knew how to organize information. She knew how to trace a reference through a maze of cross-citations and secondary sources and institutional records until she had built from 100 separate fragments a complete and accurate picture of a thing that someone had worked hard to hide. She had been doing exactly that for years. Marcus said quietly, "What do you want to do?" Richard looked at this conference room wall. Outside, somewhere in the building, Abigail was sitting in a room waiting for him to decide. He thought about the morning she had signed the prenuptial agreement, the way she had read it carefully, the way she had asked her attorney, a young man from a small firm who had clearly been overwhelmed by the moment, whether there were concerns she should raise. He thought about the way she had looked at him across the table before she signed it. A look he had read at the time as resignation, and now 15 years later understood may have been something else entirely. She had been 29 years old. She had been in love with him, or something she believed was love, which at 29 and without much reference point can be indistinguishable from the thing itself. She had signed a document that stripped her of almost every legal protection marriage could offer her, and she had done it because he had told her it was necessary, that the prenup was simply about protecting what he had built, that it had nothing to do with what they would build together. He had believed himself when he said it. That was the thing about Richard Clayton that Marcus Webb did not fully understand, and that Abigail, who had lived with him for 15 years, understood completely. He believed himself. He had always believed himself. He had built an empire and a marriage and a self-image, all on the same foundation, which was the certainty that he understood the value of things better than anyone else in the room, and that people who did not see the value the way he saw it were simply less equipped for the real world than he was. She had not been less equipped. She had been listening. "Tell the judge," Richard said, "that we need to discuss settlement." Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded slowly and reached for his jacket. Back in courtroom 217, Patricia Vance was standing near the respondent's table speaking quietly with Daniel Holt when Richard and Marcus returned. The gallery had shifted again. There were more people now drawn. Richard assumed by whatever had circulated through the building's informal networks in the past hour. Court buildings had their own kind of gossip infrastructure. Something interesting was happening in 217A. People had come to see. Abigail sat in her chair with her hands folded on the table. She looked up when Richard entered the room. He made himself look back at her this time. 15 years is a long time to live alongside a person without seeing them clearly. He looked at her now the way you look at a painting you've walked past every day for a decade, and one morning, for a reason you can't entirely identify, you stop and actually look at it, and you find that it is far more intricate, far more carefully constructed, far more full of intent and detail than you had ever bothered to notice before. She looked back at him with those same eyes, quiet, patient, holding something he could not name, and then she looked back down at her folder. Caldwell entered. "Before we resume," Marcus said, rising, "the petitioner would like to request a short period to explore the possibility of a negotiated settlement, Your Honor." Caldwell looked at him without expression. "Mr. Webb, I want to be transparent with you. Based on what was presented in this courtroom this morning, the question before me is no longer solely one of marital asset distribution. I have already been in contact with the federal district clerk. There are matters raised by this morning's evidence that exist outside the scope of my jurisdiction in this proceeding. I'll grant you time to explore settlement, but I want you to understand that a settlement in this courtroom today does not resolve the broader questions that have been raised. Understood, Your Honor. You have 30 minutes. 30 minutes? Richard looked at the clock on the wall of the courtroom as he followed Marcus toward the side door, and he thought about how the morning had begun 18 minutes early. Navy blue suit, the thin leather portfolio that said he had already won, and how the same clock that was now measuring the last 30 minutes of his financial empire had been running all along, and he had simply not been watching it. Abigail had been watching it. She had been watching everything. The 30 minutes Caldwell had granted did not feel like a negotiation. It felt like a confession booth. Marcus Webb had requested a private conference room, and they had been given the same fourth-floor room that still smelled of old carpet. But this time, Daniel Holt came with Patricia Vance, and Vance sat down across from Marcus, with her document case open, and her hands flat on the table, and looked at Richard Clayton with the expression of a woman who had been preparing for this specific conversation for a very long time and had absolutely no intention of making it comfortable for anyone. Richard sat at the end of the table and said nothing. Holt spoke first, which surprised everyone, including, it appeared, Holt himself. I want to say something before we start. This isn't about destroying anyone. Abigail never wanted this to be about destruction. Vance looked at him sideways. Holt was earnest, and earnestness in a settlement conference was a liability, and she knew it, but she let him continue. She wanted what was fair, Holt said. That's what she told me when she first came to my office. She said, and I'm quoting because I wrote it down, she said, "I don't want more than what's right. I just want what can't be denied anymore." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Marcus said, "What are you proposing?" Vance opened a page in her case and slid it across the table. It was a single sheet with numbers on it, and Marcus picked it up, looked at it, and set it down on the table facing Richard without expression. Richard looked at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time. 60% of all domestic assets. Full legal title to the Eleanor Marsh Trust transferred to Abigail. The marital residence in Lincoln Park free and clear, a structured cash settlement payable over 18 months, and one line at the bottom of the page that was not a number at all, it was a sentence, and the sentence read, "Petitioner will provide full cooperation to any federal investigation arising from matters disclosed in these proceedings." Marcus said quietly, "Richard." Richard said nothing. Vance said, "I'll be direct, Mr. Clayton. You're in a room with two choices, and I want you to understand them both completely before we leave this table." She folded her hands. Choice 1 is what you're looking at on that page. Choice 2 is we walk back into that courtroom, the judge formally refers the evidentiary record to the federal district, and you spend the next several years defending against charges that include wire fraud, tax evasion, fraudulent use of a deceased person's identity, and perjury committed in a court proceeding this morning when your attorney represented to Judge Caldwell that your financial disclosures at the time of the prenuptial agreement were complete and accurate. Marcus started to object. Vance held up one hand. "That is not a threat, Mr. Webb. That is a description of the procedural sequence that will follow if we don't reach an agreement in this room. I'm not making it. Judge Caldwell is making it. He told you himself that a settlement here doesn't stop the federal question. But full cooperation today, documented and submitted as part of the settlement agreement, is the kind of mitigating factor that federal prosecutors and judges take seriously. The difference between cooperation and non-cooperation in a case like this can be measured in years." Richard looked at the single sheet of paper. He thought about the morning he had told Abigail to sign the prenuptial agreement. He had said it with such confidence, such absolute, unquestioned confidence, that he had not even registered the expression on her face. He was registering it now. Across 15 years of distance, he was finally reading what had been written there in the face of a 29-year-old woman standing at the beginning of a decision that would define the next decade and a half of her life. She had not looked frightened. She had looked like a woman making a note. He pushed the sheet back toward Vance. "I need 20 minutes alone with my attorney." Vance and Holt stood and left the room without discussion. Marcus waited until the door closed. Then he said, "Richard, listen to me, not as your attorney, as the person who has known you for 11 years. He paused. "This is the exit. This is the only exit that doesn't end in a federal facility. I need you to take it." Richard looked at the window. "She was tracking everything," he said. "Yes." "For how long?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Based on the documentation she submitted, the earliest records go back 8 years. She started tracking the wire transfers 8 years ago." 8 years. He had sat across the breakfast table from this woman for 8 years while she was building a case against him. He had complained to her about difficult clients and celebrated closed deals and argued about where they would spend Christmas, and she had listened to all of it with the quiet patience that he had always found mildly irritating, and she had been building a case. "She never said a word?" Richard said. "No," Marcus agreed. "She didn't." Something in Richard's chest moved in a way he had no vocabulary for. It was not guilt exactly, though guilt was somewhere in the vicinity. It was something closer to awe, the specific and humbling awe of a man who has spent his life believing he was the most capable person in any room, who has just been shown with documentary precision that he was not. "Tell them yes," he said. Marcus let out a breath that he had been holding for several hours. "I'll get Vance." The settlement conference took another 40 minutes. Every line of the agreement was reviewed, every term confirmed, every number fixed in the record. Marcus negotiated 3 modifications. The payment timeline was extended to 24 months. The cooperation clause was narrowed slightly in its language, and a confidentiality provision was added, covering the specifics of the trust documentation. Vance accepted the first 2 and rejected the third. "The cooperation clause stands as written," she said, "and the confidentiality provision doesn't apply to federal proceedings. That's non-negotiable." Marcus looked at Richard. Richard said nothing. Marcus said, "Accepted." When they returned to courtroom 217A, the gallery had filled further. Richard counted 14 people in the benches, which was more than he had seen in any civil proceeding outside of a headline case. The Tribune journalist had been joined by someone Richard didn't recognize, who might have been a second reporter, or might have been someone's paralegal, or might have been a person who had simply walked in off the street because the building had a public gallery and word traveled. Abigail was already at her table. She did not look at the door when Richard entered. Caldwell reconvened with the brisk efficiency of a judge who had allotted time and expected it to have been used productively. "Mr. Webb, have you reached an agreement?" Marcus stood. "Your Honor, the parties have reached a settlement agreement in principle, the terms of which we are prepared to submit to the court for approval." Caldwell looked at Holt and Vance. "Respondent confirms." Vance stood. "Respondent confirms, Your Honor." Caldwell looked at the paper submitted and read it in the way judges read documents carefully, completely, without any expression that could be read as approval or disapproval until he had finished. Then he set it down. "Before I approve this agreement," he said, "I want to address the court record directly." He looked up. "The evidence submitted in this proceeding today raises questions that cannot be resolved by a civil settlement between parties. I want that to be clearly understood by everyone in this room. The court is formally transmitting the evidentiary records submitted by Respondents' Counsel Exhibits A through W to the Office of the Federal District Court for appropriate review. That transmission will occur today. The settlement agreement before me does not alter that transmission and does not constitute any form of immunity or protection from federal investigation or prosecution." He looked at Richard. Richard looked back at him. "Mr. Clayton," the judge said, "I have been on this bench for 31 years. I have seen a great many things in this courtroom. I want you to understand that what was presented today is among the most serious evidentiary records I have encountered in a civil proceeding in my career. I am approving this settlement because the respondent has asked me to, and because it is in her interest to do so. But I am not approving it with any illusion that justice has been fully served within these walls today. The fuller accounting will happen elsewhere." Richard said nothing. Caldwell turned to Abigail, and this was the moment that several people in the gallery would later describe when they talked about what happened in courtroom 217A, because Caldwell, who had addressed parties through their counsel all morning, spoke directly to Abigail Clayton. "Mrs. Clayton," he said, His voice had changed. Not softer exactly, he was not a soft man, but something in the efficiency of it had given way to something older and more considered. The court has reviewed the respondent's evidentiary submission in its totality. I want to say for the record that the work represented in that submission is extraordinary in its thoroughness, its documentation, and its patience. He paused on that word. I've seen litigants spend millions on investigative resources and not produce what you produced. I want you to know that this court sees that. Abigail looked up at the judge. She said, "Thank you, Your Honor." 3 words. Quiet, clear, and completely steady. Caldwell nodded. He signed the settlement agreement and handed it to the clerk. The court approves the settlement as submitted. This proceeding is adjourned. He looked at the room. I'll also note that this courtroom is a public proceeding, and anything said here is a matter of public record. He stood. The bailiff called the room. And then something happened that no one in the gallery had expected because it violated the usual emotional grammar of a courtroom. The side that wins tends to exhale, to smile, to touch each other's arms, to gather papers with the quick energy of people who can finally move again. The side that loses tends to move slowly to avoid eye contact, to execute the procedural motions of departure with the heavy deliberateness of people who need their bodies to be busy so their minds don't have to process what just happened. Abigail did not exhale. She did not smile. She did not turn to Holt and Vance with relief or celebration. She closed the thin folder on the table in front of her, the same folder she had been reading when Richard arrived that morning. The same folder she had been turning pages in throughout the proceeding, and she set it neatly on top of her document case, and she stood and she began buttoning her gray jacket with the calm precision of a woman completing a task she had planned to complete. Richard watched her from across the room. Marcus was already on the phone speaking quietly to someone at the firm. The gallery was stirring. The journalist was writing rapidly in a notebook. Patricia Vance was shaking Holt's hand with the controlled satisfaction of someone who had done exactly what she came to do. Richard stood in the middle of all of it and watched his wife button her jacket. He crossed the room. He had not planned to. He had not made a decision to do it. His body simply moved in the direction of the only thing in the room that still held his attention, and he arrived at the respondent's table and stood there until Abigail looked up. She looked at him without expression. He had a dozen things in his mind to say. He had the version where he asked how she had done it. He had the version where he said something about Eleanor, though he could not find the words for that version and was not certain he deserved to speak them. He had the version where he said he was sorry, which was the truest version, except that the word sorry had been devalued by 15 years of being deployed in smaller and more tactical ways, and he did not trust it to carry the weight it needed to carry right now. He said, "You could have told me you knew. Years ago. You could have said something." Abigail looked at him for a moment, then she said, "I know. Why didn't you?" She tilted her head very slightly, not unkindly, the way a teacher tilts her head when a student has asked a question that reveals they have not understood the lesson, and she is deciding how to explain it without embarrassing them. "Because if I had told you I knew," she said, "you would have moved everything. You would have restructured and re-registered and relocated every asset in that trust before I could document it. You would have destroyed the evidence, and then you would have destroyed me." She looked at him steadily. "I needed you to believe you had already won. That was the only way any of it was possible." Richard stood with that for a moment. "The prenup," he said, "the morning you signed it, you knew then that something was wrong." "I knew you weren't showing me everything," she said. "I didn't know what everything was yet." "But you signed it anyway." She looked at him with those patient eyes. "I signed it because I was 29 and I loved you, and I thought knowing you were hiding something was different from knowing what you were hiding. I signed it because I thought maybe I was wrong. I signed it because your attorney had driven me to the appointment and I had 4 hours' notice and a man I loved telling me this was necessary." She paused. "And then I spent the next 15 years finding out what you were hiding, and I documented all of it." Richard looked at the folder she had closed and set neatly on her document case. "That folder," he said. "What was actually in it?" Abigail looked at the folder. Then she looked back at him, and for the first time all morning something moved in her face that was not patience or calculation or the still water of controlled emotion. It was something human and tired and real. "Letters," she said. "From Eleanor. She wrote me letters every week for the last 2 years of her life. I read one every morning before a hearing. I've been doing that since this process started." She picked up the case. "I wanted to remember who I was doing this for." Richard had nothing to say to that. Abigail picked up her folder, and her case nodded once briefly in the way that people nod when they have said the only thing that needed to be said, and she walked past him toward the courtroom doors. She did not hurry. She did not look back. Patricia Vance fell in beside her at the doors, and Holt was on her other side, and the three of them moved through the gallery, which had gone very quiet, and through the heavy oak doors, and out into the corridor. Richard stood at the respondent's table in the empty courtroom for a moment. Then Marcus was beside him, phone still in hand, face carrying the expression of a man who has many urgent calls to make and is exercising considerable restraint about making them immediately. "The Federal District Office will want to speak with us by end of day," he said quietly. "We need to talk about cooperation strategy before that call." Richard nodded. He picked up his portfolio from the petitioner's table. The thin, understated one he had selected to project controlled confidence, and he held it and felt how light it was, and then he set it back down on the table and left it there. He didn't need it anymore. In the corridor outside Courtroom 217A, the building moved around him with the complete indifference it had maintained all morning. A group of law students was being guided through by a clerk. An attorney Richard didn't recognize was arguing quietly on his phone near the elevator bank. 2 women in business suits were reviewing a document between them, one pointing at a line with a pen, the other nodding. Richard walked to the elevator and pressed the button and waited. The doors opened. He stepped in. As they closed, he caught a glimpse down the corridor, the long perspective of the hallway, the overhead lights, the far end where the main entrance was visible. And for a single second at the far end of that corridor, he saw a gray suit and a simple pulled-back hairstyle moving toward the exit with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who had somewhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. Then the elevator doors closed and she was gone. The ride down was 12 floors. Richard Clayton stood in the elevator with his hands at his sides and thought about 8 years. He thought about breakfast tables and quiet evenings and arguments about small things and the 1,000 ordinary moments that make up a marriage. And he thought about the fact that running through all of those moments, invisible and patient and meticulous, had been the work of a woman who understood that the most powerful thing she could do was not to fight him. It was to let him keep believing he had already won. He had built an empire on the certainty that he understood the value of things. He had spent 15 years sharing a home with someone whose value he had never bothered to assess. The elevator reached the lobby and opened, and the cold air of the building's entrance hit him, and he walked out into it. Somewhere on the other side of the building, Abigail Clayton walked out into the same Chicago morning, carrying a folder full of her sister's letters, and turned toward whatever came next. The story of what happened in Courtroom 217A did not stay in Courtroom 217A. It never does. Not in a building full of attorneys and clerks and journalists and law students who have phones and contacts and the particular appetite for a story that everyone in the legal profession develops after enough years of watching most cases resolve in ways that are technically correct and emotionally inert. By the time Richard Clayton's elevator reached the lobby that afternoon, the Tribune journalist had filed his first dispatch. By the time Marcus Webb had made his third call to the firm's crisis management contact, 2 other publications had picked up the wire. By the time Abigail Clayton's car had cleared the Dirksen Building's parking structure and turned north on Dearborn, her name was in a headline. She did not see the headline until that evening. Patricia Vance called her at 6:47. Abigail was sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment she had moved into 4 months ago when the separation became formal, a 2-bedroom on the north side 3rd floor with windows that faced east and caught the morning light. She had chosen it specifically for the morning light. Eleanor had always said that a room with eastern windows was a room that started the day honestly. "You should know what's out there," Vance said without preamble. That was one of the things Abigail had come to value about Patricia Vance in the 8 months they had worked together. The woman did not believe in softening information as a courtesy. Information was a tool, and a blunted tool served no one. "How bad?" "It's not bad. That's why I'm calling." A pause, and Abigail heard the sound of Vance setting something down on a hard surface. The Tribune piece is accurate. They have the settlement figures wrong. They're reporting 65% instead of 60%, and the trust value is being reported as $130 million instead of $122 because someone in the building apparently rounded up in the retelling. But the core facts are correct. The trust, Eleanor's name, the forged signature, the federal referral, all of it. Abigail looked at the folder on the table in front of her. She had set it there when she came in the way she always set it on whatever surface she was working, near the way you keep something close that you need to remember is real. And Richard, his publicist released a statement at 5 o'clock. It says he and his wife have reached an amicable resolution and that he intends to cooperate fully with any governmental inquiries. Standard crisis language. His attorney drafted it, you can tell. Another pause. Abigail, the federal office called my line at 4:30. They want to speak with you next week, not as a subject, as a cooperating witness. They want your documentation. Abigail said, They can have all of it. I told them that. They seemed unsurprised. Vance's voice held something that was not quite warmth, but was adjacent to it, the measured appreciation of a professional for someone who had done difficult work well. You should also know that I had a call from a reporter at the Sun-Times who specifically wants to speak with you, not about the legal proceedings, about Eleanor. Abigail was quiet for a moment. About the libraries, Vance said carefully. Abigail looked at the folder. She thought about Eleanor at 22, fresh out of her education program, walking into a second-grade classroom for the first time with the particular combination of terror and joy that Eleanor had always worn when she was doing something that mattered to her. She thought about the letters in the folder, the weekly letters written in Eleanor's cramped and energetic handwriting, full of news about her students and requests for book recommendations, and the specific ordinary joy of a woman who loved what she did and did not have enough time to do it. Tell them I'll think about it, Abigail said. She hung up and sat with her hands around a cup of tea that had gone cold and thought about what came next, which was the question she had been deliberately not asking herself for 8 years, because asking it would have meant imagining the end of the work, and imagining the end of the work would have made the work feel finite, and the work could not feel finite until it was finished. It was finished now. The question of what came next was suddenly urgently real. She had not thought in any serious way about what life looked like on the other side of the courtroom. She had thought about the trust. She had thought about Eleanor's name being cleared, not legally cleared, because Eleanor had committed no crime for which she needed clearing, but restored, returned, given back its true meaning, rather than the hollowed and fraudulent meaning Richard had grafted onto it. She had thought about the libraries in an abstract way, the way you think about something that is real and important, but too large and too far off to be held in the mind as a concrete plan rather than a direction. Now it was a plan. Now it had to be. She opened the folder and read 2 pages of the last letter Eleanor had sent her, written 6 weeks before she died. The handwriting was slightly less precise. By that point, Eleanor had been tired, and the medication affected her fine motor control, but the voice was entirely itself. Entirely Eleanor asking whether Abigail had read the new biography of Eleanor Roosevelt that had just come out, saying that she thought the public library in Rockford needed a better section on women's history, saying that she wanted to take her second graders to the library on a field trip before the semester ended. She never got to take them. Abigail closed the folder and made a list on the back of an envelope. Not a formal list, not the kind she made when she was tracking transfers and building documentation, but the kind a person makes when they are standing at the beginning of something and need to see it take shape in handwriting to know it is real. The first thing on the list was, call Mom. The second thing was, find an architect who builds libraries. The third thing was, learn what it takes. She folded the envelope and put it in the folder alongside Eleanor's letters and sat in the morning light. It was evening now, so there was no light, but the apartment still held the quality of a room that knew light was coming, and she allowed herself for the first time since the day she had walked into Daniel Holt's office with a flash drive containing 8 years of financial documentation, to simply exist in this present moment without the ongoing work of the case pressing against every other thought. She cried for about 4 minutes. Not dramatically, just honestly the way grief arrives when you have been holding it at a professional distance for a long time and you finally let it into the room. She cried for Eleanor and for the 29-year-old version of herself who had signed a document in good faith and then spent 15 years quietly and methodically dismantling the damage that signature had allowed. And she cried because it was over, and because the word over contained both relief and loss, and because she did not entirely know yet what the relief was going to feel like when it had more room to breathe. Then she wiped her eyes and called her mother. Her mother picked up on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting. "I saw the news," her mother said. "I know. Are you okay?" Abigail thought about that question for a moment, not the automatic version of it, the reflexive yes that social convention requires, but the actual question asked by the woman who had raised her and known her for 51 years, and was using the word okay to mean something considerably more specific than the absence of crisis. "I think so," she said. "I think I will be." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Eleanor would have had something to say about all of this." "She would have had a lot to say," Abigail said. "She would have found the whole thing absolutely unbelievable, and then she would have asked me to recommend a book about it." Her mother laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her the kind that grief produces sometimes at unexpected moments, and it was one of the most genuine sounds Abigail had heard in months. "The libraries," her mother said. "You mentioned that to me once, a long time ago, before things got complicated." "Before things got complicated," Abigail repeated. "Are you going to do it?" "Yes." "Good." A pause. "Your father would have liked that. He always said the library was the most democratic building in any town, free to anyone who walked through the door." Abigail looked at the folder on the table. "That's exactly what I was thinking," she said. 3 days later, she met with Patricia Vance at the firm to review the settlement mechanics and discuss the timeline for asset transfer. The Eleanor Marsh Trust, Richard's vehicle for 15 years, now legally hers by court order, was in the process of being restructured. The Cayman registration would be dissolved. The assets would be repatriated through a sequence of legal steps that Vance walked her through with the same systematic patience she had used to walk Judge Caldwell through the evidence 3 days earlier. "It'll take approximately 4 months for the full transfer to clear all the international and domestic regulatory requirements," Vance said. "During that time, you'll have access to a portion of the domestic settlement funds. The Lincoln Park property closes to you in 6 weeks." Abigail nodded. "I don't want the Lincoln Park property." Vance looked at her. I know what it's worth. I don't want it. Sell it. Use the proceeds as part of the foundation's initial endowment." Vance wrote something. "The foundation. You want to move forward with that?" "I've already spoken with an attorney who specializes in nonprofit establishment. I want the foundation registered within 60 days of the full asset transfer. Eleanor Marsh Foundation. The mission is public library construction and endowment in underserved communities. We start in Rockford." Vance looked at her over the top of her reading glasses. "Abigail, you're aware that you're talking about an operation that, if you capitalize it at even a fraction of what you're receiving, would be one of the larger private library endowments established in Illinois in the last decade." "I'm aware." "Do you have people, board members, operational staff, program directors?" "I'm building that. I have some names from my time working in library systems. I know the field. I know what the gaps look like." She paused. "I was a librarian, Patricia. I know what libraries do for people who don't have other options. I know what they meant to Eleanor. I know what they meant to me when I was growing up in Rockford, with parents who couldn't afford to buy books." She looked at Vance steadily. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Vance looked back at her for a moment. Then she nodded once in the way that decisive people nod when they have satisfied themselves that a decision is sound. "I'll note that in the file," she said, and returned to her documents. The federal interview happened 10 days after the courtroom. Abigail sat in a conference room in the federal building 2 blocks from the Dirksen with 2 investigators and a prosecutor named Catherine Reyes, who was approximately 40 years old and had the contained energy of a person running several complex operations simultaneously. "We appreciate you coming in," Reyes said. "Of course. I want to start by confirming that you understand you are here as a cooperating witness, not as a subject of any investigation." "I understand. And you're prepared to provide all documentation currently in your possession relating to the financial structure we've been reviewing." "Everything I have," Abigail said. "I can also walk you through the methodology I used to trace the transfers, if that's helpful." Some of the intermediate entities are not immediately obvious in the documentation. I can show you how I identified the connections. Reyes looked at her for a moment. One of the investigators made a note. That would be very helpful, Reyes said. Can I ask, and you're under no obligation to answer this if it's outside the scope of what you want to discuss, how did you first identify that assets were being moved? Abigail looked at this table. She thought about the specific evening 8 years ago when she had been reviewing a set of household financial records. For a completely ordinary reason, she was updating their personal accounting after a tax preparation meeting, and she had found a discrepancy. A small one. The kind of discrepancy that most people would attribute to rounding or timing differences or simple clerical error. She had attributed it to those things for approximately 2 weeks, and then she had pulled a subsidiary report. And then she had cross-referenced a registration document she had found in Richard's home office while looking for something entirely unrelated, and the small discrepancy had opened into a larger one, and the larger one had opened into something that had no benign explanation. A number that didn't add up, she said. A small one. I had a background in information research. I knew how to follow a reference. She paused. I was a librarian. We're trained to find things. Reyes looked at her steadily. Mrs. Clayton. Abigail. Abigail, what you assembled over the course of 8 years working independently, without subpoena authority, without forensic accounting resources, and without any formal investigative training, it's a more complete, evidentiary picture than most cases of this complexity produce with full institutional support. I want you to know that. Abigail said, thank you. Do you know what that took? The question was not quite professional. It was the question of a woman asking another woman something real across the surface of a formal proceeding in the way that sometimes happens when two people recognize something in each other that protocol doesn't quite have a category for. Abigail was quiet for a moment. Patience, she said, and knowing that the truth was there. You can spend a long time looking for something if you're certain it exists. The interview lasted 3 hours. She walked Reyes and her team through every exhibit, every connection, every intermediate entity, every discrepancy she had identified and documented. She showed them the methodology she had used to trace the wire transfers through the holding companies. She explained how she had obtained the Cayman records through a combination of a formal legal request filed by Vance's firm and a contact at a financial regulatory body in the Cayman Islands who had confirmed, without violating confidentiality, that certain documents she was seeking were obtainable through official channels. She had then obtained them through those channels with Vance's guidance over a period of 14 months. Everything she had was legal. Every document had been obtained through proper process. That had been the most important constraint of the entire 8-year project, and she had never once violated it because she had understood from the beginning that anything obtained improperly would be challengeable, and a challengeable document was worse than no document at all. When the interview was over, Reyes walked her to the elevator. "We'll be in touch," she said. "This is going to be a lengthy process. Federal cases of this complexity don't move quickly." "I know," Abigail said. "Will you be available for further interviews, document review, potentially testimony?" "Yes, for as long as it takes." Reyes looked at her for a moment. "Can I ask you one more thing off the record?" Abigail looked at her. "Why the Eleanor Marsh name?" Reyes said. "When you discovered that the trust was named after your sister, what was your reaction? In that moment when you first found it?" Abigail had not been asked that question before. She had been asked many things in the past 2 weeks by her attorney, by the judge, by the federal investigators, by the reporter from the Sun-Times, who she had eventually agreed to speak with briefly. But no one had asked her that specific question. She looked at the elevator doors. "I had been tracking the trust for about a year before I found the name," she said. "I knew there was a Cayman entity. I knew it was connected to Richard. I didn't know the name until I received a copy of the founding documents." She paused. "When I read it, I sat in my car in a parking structure for about 20 minutes. I couldn't drive. My hands were shaking." "Was it grief?" Reyes asked. "Some of it," Abigail said. "But mostly it was confirmation. I had known for years that what Richard was doing was wrong. I had documented it methodically, and I had kept a kind of professional distance from it, the way you have to keep distance from something in order to do it accurately. but seeing Eleanor's name on that document made it... She stopped, started again. It made it true in a different way. It made it something I couldn't organize at a distance anymore. It made it personal in a way that the numbers never quite did. She looked at Reyes. That was the day I called Patricia Vance, she said. I had been gathering documents for 7 years. I called her the same evening I found Eleanor's name on that founding document. I said, I have everything I need. Tell me how we finish this. The elevator doors opened. Abigail stepped in. She said, Abigail continued her hand holding the door. Give me 6 months. And I said, you have 2. She got it done in 5. The doors closed. Outside the federal building, the city moved through a Tuesday afternoon with its usual indifference, and Abigail Clayton walked to the corner and stood in the cold air for a moment, looking north toward the place in the city where she had grown up, reading books she had borrowed because she couldn't afford to buy them, in a neighborhood that had a library 2 blocks from her family's house that she had visited every Saturday morning from the time she was 7 years old until the time she left for college. The building was still there. She had checked. It needed a new roof, a new HVAC system, a renovation of the children's section, and a significant expansion of its community programming budget. She had written all of that down on the back of an envelope alongside 2 other items, and she had put the envelope in a folder alongside her sister's letters, and she carried both of them with her everywhere she went. She started walking north. She had somewhere to be, and she had all the time in the world to get there. And for the first time in 8 years, the road ahead of her was open in a way that she had not let herself imagine until this moment. The city noise rose around her, buses and voices, and the particular urban rhythm of a place that moves whether you are ready or not. She moved with it. You said part 5, lưu ý, viết đủ 3.600 đến 3.800 từ, liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Part 5, lưu ý, viết đủ 3.600 đến 3.800 từ, liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc, chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh tập trung vào hành động cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần 5 đạt điểm 10 trên 10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh sửa lỗi ai. Kế theo ngôi thứ 3 giữ độ kịch tính không viết lan man. Kết thúc dùng câu khẳng định mạnh để khép lại câu chuyện rõ ràng, trọn vẹn. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn, không nhảy sang mức document mới. 2 đến 3 phút cần có mini climax và đặt 10 đến 15 mini climax mới. Phần cứ 10 đến 12 phút có một twist lớn sâu sắc, đan xen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn. Tăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật thêm nhịp điệu, kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8 đến 10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả. Lưu ý, không mô tả cảnh viết văn bản, phù hợp với TTS và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh nhé. Show more. 13:15. Claude responded. 4 months after the hearing in courtroom 217, a letter arrived at the offices of Webb, Garrett, and Holloway, addressed to Marcus Webb personally. 4 months after the hearing in courtroom 217, a letter arrived at the offices of Webb, Garrett, and Holloway, addressed to Marcus Webb personally. It was not from Abigail's attorneys. It was not from the federal prosecutor's office, though letters from that office had been arriving with increasing frequency and decreasing pleasantness since the referral. It was not from any of the 7 financial institutions that had been contacted as part of the federal investigation, and it was not from any of the journalists who had been calling Marcus's assistant with a persistence that the assistant had begun describing in her end-of-day summaries as aggressive. It was from Richard Clayton. Marcus opened it at his desk and read it twice. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was not something Marcus Webb did. He was not a ceiling-looking man. He was a forward-looking man, a document-looking man, a man whose gaze was trained on the next thing that needed to be done. Looking at the ceiling meant something had stopped him, and very few things stopped Marcus Webb. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph was about the federal proceedings which were now formally open and about Richard's decision to retain separate criminal defense counsel, which Marcus had both recommended and anticipated. The second paragraph was about the firm's fees and the mechanics of disengagement from the representation, which were professional and correct and unremarkable. The third paragraph was the one that had made Marcus look at the ceiling. It said, "I have been thinking about what Abigail said in the courtroom, about Eleanor's letters. I don't expect you to pass this along, and I'm not asking you to. I'm writing it because I need to say it somewhere, and you are the only person I have left who knew me when I believed I was the kind of man who deserved what I had built. I was wrong about a great many things. I was most wrong about the one that cost me the most. That is all." Marcus folded the letter and placed it in the client file. He did not pass it along, but he thought about it for the rest of the day in the way you think about something that has revealed an unexpected dimension in a person you believed you understood completely. Abigail was in Rockford when the asset transfer cleared. She had driven up the morning after receiving Vance's confirmation call, partly because she had a meeting with a local city official about the library project, and partly because she needed to see the town from this side of everything that had happened, needed to walk its streets and breathe its air, and locate herself in the geography of her own history, now that the history had changed shape so completely. Her mother still lived in the same house on the same street where Abigail and Eleanor had grown up. The house needed painting. The garden was still meticulous because her mother had never been willing to let a garden go untended, no matter what else was happening in the world. Abigail sat at her mother's kitchen table and drank coffee and told her the transfer had cleared. Her mother set down her own cup very carefully. All of it. All of it. $122 million from the trust, 60% of the domestic assets. The cash settlement begins dispersing next month. Her mother was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands, which were the hands of a woman in her late 70s who had spent her life working with them, repairing watches, tending a garden, holding the hands of 2 daughters through every difficulty those daughters had encountered. Then she looked at Abigail. "Eleanor would not believe this," she said. "No," Abigail agreed. "She would be laughing. She would be laughing, and then she would be furious on my behalf, and then she would be laughing again." Her mother smiled. It was a full smile, the kind that lives somewhere below grief and above ordinary happiness, in the territory that people who have lost someone they love occupy when they allow themselves to be joyful without apology. And then she'd ask you what book she should read about it. Abigail laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had not produced without effort in a very long time. It lasted about 4 seconds and left her eyes bright. "I already have a recommendation," Abigail said. "I've been thinking about it for a while." Her mother reached across the table and put her hand over Abigail's. They sat like that for a moment without speaking, 2 women in a kitchen in Rockford with the morning light coming through the window. Honestly, the way Eleanor had always said, morning light in an east-facing room arrived, and the quiet between them was not empty. It was full of the specific weight of a grief that had begun to transform slowly and with great difficulty into something that could be carried differently. Not lighter exactly, but differently, with more purpose. The Foundation's first board meeting took place 6 weeks later in a borrowed conference room at the Rockford Public Library. Abigail had selected 7 board members, each chosen for a specific combination of expertise and personal alignment with the mission. There was a retired school superintendent from the south side of Chicago who had spent 30 years fighting for library funding in underprivileged districts. There was a woman who had run a community foundation in Detroit and understood the mechanics of large-scale philanthropic endowment in a way that Abigail was still learning. There was an architect who specialized in civic buildings and had designed 4 public libraries in the Midwest in the past decade. There was an education policy researcher from Northwestern. There was a librarian currently working, currently underpaid, and currently doing the exact kind of daily work that the foundation was being built to support from a small branch on the west side of Chicago. And there was Daniel Holt. He had looked genuinely surprised when Abigail had called him. "You want me on the board," he had said. "You believe the case was winnable when most people wouldn't have taken it," she said. "That's the kind of judgment I want making decisions about this foundation." A pause. "Abigail Patricia Vance is the one who—" "Patricia Vance is going to be our general counsel. I need her there, not on the board. I need you on the board." Another pause. "You read Eleanor's letters when I showed them to you. You understood immediately why this mattered. That's not nothing, Daniel." He had been quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, of course. I'd be honored." At the first board meeting, Abigail stood at the front of the room and spoke without notes. She had written notes and then set them aside because she knew this material in a way that did not require notes. She knew it the way she knew Eleanor's handwriting. She knew it in her body, in the particular knowledge that lives below language, in the place where things that have cost you something come to rest. She told them about Eleanor. She told them about the second-grade classroom and the field trip that never happened, and the letters written in cramped and energetic handwriting, and the last letter, the one that mentioned the library 2 blocks from their childhood home, and the women's history section that needed improving. She told them that Eleanor had died in a hospital room in Rockford, while their mother sat beside her and held her hand, and that the medical care that might have bought more time had not been fully accessible because of resources, and she told them that she was not interested in relitigating the injustice of Eleanor's death because Eleanor would not have wanted that. What Eleanor would have wanted, Abigail told them, was a library. Several libraries, actually, with good sections on women's history and strong children's programs and extended hours and the kind of community programming that turned a building full of books into a place that could change what was possible for a child growing up without many options. "We're starting in Rockford," she said, "and then we're going wherever the need is greatest. We are not a prestige institution. We are not interested in naming rights or donor showcases or the kind of philanthropy that is primarily about the philanthropist. This foundation is about the second grader who walks through the door on a Saturday morning because someone in her family told her the library was free." She looked around the table. "That's who we're building for. Does everyone understand?" Everyone understood. The federal investigation into Richard Clayton moved with the deliberate and slightly glacial momentum of complex financial crime prosecutions, which is to say, it moved slowly and with considerable weight behind it. By the time spring arrived, a grand jury had been convened. By early summer, Marcus Webb's successor as Richard's counsel, a criminal defense attorney named Jonathan Farrow, who specialized in white-collar cases and charged accordingly, had entered discussions with the prosecutor's office about the scope of potential charges. Catherine Reyes called Abigail in April to update her on the timeline. "I want to manage expectations," she said. "Federal financial crime cases at this complexity level take time. We're talking years, not months." "I know," Abigail said. "The cooperation agreement is holding. His attorney has been responsive. Whether that translates to a plea or goes to trial, I can't predict yet." "What are you looking at in terms of charges?" Reyes was careful. "Wire fraud is the centerpiece. We're also looking at tax evasion, fraudulent use of identity, and perjury, the representation made in the civil proceeding about the completeness of the financial disclosures. That last one matters to us specifically because it was made in a court of law." Abigail thought about Marcus Webb standing in front of Judge Caldwell, saying that the prenuptial agreement had been executed with complete and accurate financial disclosure. She thought about the expression on Caldwell's face when the documents came out. "What happens to his assets while the case is pending?" she said. "The domestic assets subject to your settlement agreement are yours and are not affected by the federal proceedings. The corporate holdings are a different question. Several of the entities are under review for forfeiture." A pause. "His empire, as you'd know it, is effectively frozen. The deals he was working, the partnerships he had, those are either on hold or dissolving. The business community responds quickly to federal grand jury proceedings." Abigail said nothing for a moment. "Does that give you any satisfaction?" Reyes asked. And again, it was that quality of one woman asking another something real across the surface of a professional conversation. Abigail thought about it honestly. "Not the way you might expect," she said. "I'm not glad he's suffering if that's what you're asking. I'm glad the truth is documented. I'm glad Eleanor's name is going to mean something different than it meant in those Cayman registration papers." She paused. "Mostly I'm just glad it's done." "It's not done," Reyes said gently. "Not for a while." "The part I was responsible for is done," Abigail said. "The rest of it is yours." In June, the Eleanor Marsh Foundation broke ground in Rockford. It was not a ceremony that made the national news, because national news moves toward the loudest thing in any given moment, and a groundbreaking for a public library in a mid-sized Illinois city was not loud. But the local newspaper covered it, and a photographer from a Chicago publication came up for it. And the city official who had met with Abigail in the borrowed conference room 4 months earlier stood at a podium and said things about community investment and civic renewal that were true, and also, like most things said at podiums, somewhat less than the whole story. The whole story was standing off to the side. Abigail wore a blue dress, not gray, not the understated professional armor she had worn to the courtroom. Blue, because Eleanor had loved blue, had worn it, constantly had described it once in a letter as the color that most honestly represented the feeling of being both grounded and open at the same time. Her mother was beside her. When it was Abigail's turn at the podium, she did not speak for long. She said that libraries had built her in the way that certain places build people quietly, patiently, without fanfare, by making the best of human knowledge available to anyone willing to walk through the door. She said that her sister had believed in that premise completely. She said that the building going up on this ground would carry Eleanor's name on its face, and Eleanor's philosophy and its mission, and that as long as it stood, the name Eleanor Marsh would mean what it had always meant before someone tried to make it mean something else. It would mean generosity and teaching and the irreplaceable value of a room full of books that belongs to everyone. She said, "My sister wrote me letters every week for the last 2 years of her life. In one of those letters, she mentioned that she wanted to take her second graders to the library. I'm going to make sure that every second grader in this county has a library worth visiting." She stepped back from the podium. Her mother took her hand. The applause from the small gathered crowd was genuine and not large, and it was exactly the right size for the moment. 3 weeks after this groundbreaking, Abigail received a package in the mail. No return address. Chicago postmark. Inside was a single book, a first edition carefully wrapped, a collection of essays by a writer Abigail had recommended to Richard early in their marriage one evening, when he had mentioned almost in passing that he didn't read much but thought he should. She had given him a list. He had never read any of them. There was no note in the package. She held the book for a long time and thought about who might have sent it and what sending it might have meant to the person who sent it. Then she placed it on the shelf in her apartment beside the other first editions she had kept from the marriage, the ones she had brought into it, the ones that had always been hers. She thought, even now, even at the end of everything, he is trying to say something he doesn't have the words for. She did not write back. There was nothing to write back to. But she did not throw the book away because it was a good book, and because she had learned long ago that the value of a thing does not depend entirely on the intentions of the person who offers it. The Eleanor Marsh Foundation's first library opened 14 months after the groundbreaking. It came in slightly under budget, which the architect attributed to excellent project management, and which Abigail attributed to the fact that she had spent 8 years tracking financial documentation and had developed in that time a detailed and unforgiving relationship with numbers. The children's section had been designed in consultation with a group of second-grade teachers from the Rockford School District. The women's history section was comprehensive. The community programming room ran 6 days a week. The hours were extended past 8 in the evening, which had been a specific request from a woman at the board meeting who had said simply, "Working parents need to be able to bring their kids after dinner. The whole point is access." On opening day, Abigail arrived early. She walked through the building alone before anyone else came in the particular quiet of an institution that has not yet begun its work, but holds the potential of it in every room. She ran her hand along the spines of the books in the children's section. She stood in the community programming room and looked at the empty chairs arranged in a circle and thought about all the conversations that would happen in those chairs, all the questions asked and answered, all the information exchanged, all the small and enormous ways a piece of knowledge freely given changes the trajectory of a person's life. She stood in front of the dedication plaque beside the front entrance for a long time. It read, "In memory of Eleanor Marsh, teacher, reader, believer in open doors." She touched the letters of Eleanor's name with 2 fingers. Then she heard the front door open behind her, and she turned around, and it was her mother arriving with the particular punctuality of a woman who had been on time to everything important her entire life. Her mother looked at the plaque. She did not speak for a moment. Then she said she would have complained that the plaque made her sound too serious. Abigail smiled. She would have wanted them to add something about her students. She would have wanted a joke in there somewhere. A footnote, maybe. Her mother laughed again, that full, ungovernable laugh that grief occasionally produces when it finally has enough room to coexist with joy. She laughed, and Abigail laughed with her, and the sound of it filled the entrance of a library named for a woman who had taught second grade and written letters and loved the color blue and never lived to see what her name would come to mean. The doors opened at 9 o'clock. The first person through was a child 7 or 8 years old wearing a backpack with a cartoon character on it that Abigail didn't recognize, pulling a woman by the hand, her grandmother, from the look of it, a woman in her 60s with the expression of someone who has known for a long time that the library is where you go when you need to believe the world has more in it than what you've already seen. Abigail stepped back and let them in. She watched the child walk directly to the children's section with the unerring instinct of someone who knows where they belong. And she watched the grandmother follow, and she watched the child reach up and pull a book off the shelf and hold it up and say something that Abigail couldn't hear from across the room, but that produced in the grandmother's face an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. Patricia Vance arrived at 9:15 with Daniel Holt and 2 members of the board, and later in the morning a reporter came, and the city official gave a brief statement to a small camera, and through all of it, Abigail moved through the library with the quiet, unhurried presence of someone who had built something real and understood that the building had now become larger than its builder and would continue without her needing to manage it every moment. At noon, she stepped outside for a few minutes. She stood on the front steps and looked at the street. Traffic, a woman walking a dog, 2 teenagers on bicycles, Rockford doing what Rockford did on a Tuesday in the specific ordinary beauty of a city going about its life. Her phone rang. It was Catherine Reyes. "I wanted to let you know," Reyes said, "that we filed formal charges this morning. Wire fraud, tax evasion, fraudulent use of identity, and perjury. The arraignment is scheduled for next week." Abigail stood on the steps of the Eleanor Marsh Library and listened. "I thought you should hear it directly," Reyes said, "from me." "Thank you, Catherine." A pause. "How's the library?" "Full," Abigail said. "Already." "Good." Another pause, and in it was the particular warmth of a woman who had spent a career in a system built around the worst of what people do to each other, and had learned over time to hold on to the moments when something went the other direction. "That's really good, Abigail." They hung up. Abigail put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the name on the building Eleanor Marsh Foundation, inlaid in clean letters above the entrance, and she thought about the morning in courtroom 217A, when she had sat with her hands folded and her folder open and waited for Richard Clayton to believe one final time that he had already won. She thought about the 15 years that had preceded that morning. She thought about the prenuptial agreement and the breakfast tables and the 8 years of documentation and the folder full of letters she had carried through every step of every day of the final chapter of a marriage that should have been different. She thought about Eleanor at 26, walking into a second-grade classroom with terror and joy on her face, certain that what she was about to do mattered. She thought it did matter. It all mattered. Every letter, every transfer record, every page of every document, every Saturday morning in a library with borrowed books, every single thing that built the person who had walked into that courtroom and opened a folder and changed the direction of everything. It had all been in service of this, a building full of books that anyone could walk into, a room where a 7-year-old could pull a story off a shelf and hold it up and make her grandmother's face fill with joy. Behind her, through the library's glass front, she could hear the sound of the building working voices' movement, the particular ambient energy of a place doing what it was built to do. She had spent 15 years being the quietest person in every room. She had spent 15 years watching and waiting and documenting and holding her silence like a weapon she was carefully saving for the right moment. That moment had come and gone. The weapon had been used. The damage was done, and the truth was documented, and the law was doing the slow and grinding work that law does, and her sister's name was on a building in Rockford, Illinois, and inside that building a child was holding a book. Abigail Clayton turned and walked back through the front doors. She was done being quiet.